Well, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight as we continue in our Bible study in the book of Ephesians. Want to welcome our members, of course. It's always very encouraging. Our members are able to tune in, and a lot of you have learned new technology. I realize that, and I'm just so appreciative of the effort you've gone to there. But also, we have a lot of visitors, and we really, really are grateful you're here. If we ever say anything in the study, and by we, it's usually me, but if I or any of our comments ever say anything and you got more questions about that, we'd love to hear from you. So you can always reach out to us. You can go through our website too and find information there, which is www.sunsetchurchofchrist.net. And so we're always glad, as I said, answer any questions. That really is a special thing for me. Somebody asks a Bible question, especially if it's a stumper. Give me a little chance to do some work, do some study. And I actually really genuinely appreciate that. So glad to have you all here. And I want to invite you to get a Bible out. We're going over to the book of Ephesians. We're in Ephesians chapter 6 right now. And we've been talking about the different relationships that believers have. That is to say, the relationship that we have, those particular relationships of husband and wife, parent and child, employee and employer. You remember that we said that these roles are described, usually they're put together in the New Testament. So for example, we have them all together here. We have them in Colossians 3 and 4, 1 Peter 2 and 3. He reaches out and touches these things. And these are important relationships because they constitute the majority of our life in our time. And to be a Christian isn't about the idea of being the guy on the corner with the megaphone yelling at people. In fact, very much the opposite. Being a Christian is about what kind of father are you, or what kind of mother, what kind of son, what kind of daughter, what kind of employer, what kind of employee are you. Those are the things that we really want to understand, that because we spend most of our time in those relationships, how we conduct ourselves in those relationships, how we behave in those relationships, that's what it means to be a Christian. And that's something, as I said, I think a lot of times is lost on people in the world, people who aren't Christians, people who are only nominally Christian or nominally familiar with Christianity. Like I said, a lot of times they think Christianity is the consistency of always being at church. Well, that's important, obviously, but it's just a small part, a very small part of what it is to be a Christian. And the sad thing is, there's a lot of people who, they'll go to church on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday, there's no behavior of Christ within them. If the Bible's going to make it clear to us, if I'm not the right person I need to be, then I'm not fulfilling the law of Christ. And that's a very important thing that we have going on. As we talked about these things, let me jump back here for just a second. As we talked about these things, we said what we want to understand is whenever I do these things, whenever I serve as a husband or wife or son or daughter, parent, whatever the relationship is, I am giving my effort not to that person, but to Christ. That's really important, but it's not always understood, right? So in other words, I am to owe my wife the love like Christ loved the church. And I don't love her because she deserves that. I love her because Christ deserves that. My wife gives me the gift of submission. I've never earned it. I've never deserved it. She gives it to me because she's devoted to Christ. The care I'm going to give for my parents, to honor my father and mother, as we began talking about last week, that gift, that honor that I give them isn't because they deserve it or earn it. It's because God, my heavenly Father, deserves it and earns it, and I'm going to give it to them because he's told me to. Likewise, I'm going to love and train up my children. They're not deserving of the sacrifices I need to make for them, but God is. And as we'll maybe see today, depending on our time, the same is going to be found to be true even in the workplace. And that might be the one that's the hardest to perceive in some ways, because it's not an intimate or loving relationship necessarily, but there's a lot of aspects to it that are described that might fit when we use terms about love and we consider those things. Remember last time we talked about the first part of Ephesians chapter 6, which said, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord. This is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with the promise that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth." And we talked about what that means. To honor your father and mother, when you're younger, it means the concept of obedience and behaving towards them with reverence when you're living in their home. listen to me very carefully. If you're a teenager, if you're an adolescent, you're younger than that, I want you to listen. Here's God's expectation to you. When you live in the home, when you are under your parents' roof, you owe them a sense of obedience and rule following. Rules they make, you are expected to obey. That's part of the idea of being under the head of a house. The father, the head of the house. You are submitting to that rule. If you're not going to submit to that rule, you don't belong there. And it's not uncommon that people have asked their children to leave when their children don't. You'll remember the Old Testament. We looked at that, and we saw that in the Old Testament that children that didn't do that were to be put to death. That's how serious a commandment this is. This is the first of the commandments in the 10 commandments that pertains to people. Paul goes on to say, this is a commandment with a promise. This affects your life. Now, in the context of that statement, remember we said that this commandment regarding their life referred primarily to their time in the land of Canaan. But perhaps we might go on to say that this affects your life in general. And I think certainly there's a consequential sense that's the case, but maybe also there is a providential. Consequential, what I mean by that is that people that are reverent and honoring to their parents, they do tend to have longer lives. Even if they're not Christians, people that live a certain way with reverence and dignity and obedience, a lot of times our parents are looking out for us, even if we don't perceive that, and we will have better lives. But providence is the idea that God actually acts. God actually does this. Look at verse 8 there. Verse 8, talking about those who are servants or employees, it says, when you're serving your master, he says in verse 8, knowing whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord. I've tried to tell you that statement really would apply to all of these relationships. That's really important to know. That whenever I'm the right kind of husband, and let's say it's not easy, I'm the right kind of wife, and it's not easy to be the right kind of wife. I'm the right kind of parent. I'm the right kind of child, and it's not easy. God says, when you do this, whatever you're doing that's right, and this is all right, this is what good is defined as. Remember, only God gets to define what's good. And this is good works. Whatever God defines as good, this is something important to understand, that is returned by God himself. God blesses us. God gives us good things in response to that. Debbie Watkins has got a comment here. Debbie says, even as an adult visiting in my parents' home, I should honor, respect them by following the rules of their home. Debbie, you're right. That's absolutely right. That sense of obedience and reverence to those rules is important. And like I said, I think a lot of times people feel like, well, I shouldn't have to. That's an American sentiment in particular. I think this is one of those bad things about American culture, where we esteem the idea of being free, not to be told what to do so much that it's boiled down too often into the home. And we don't appreciate the idea of how important it is that we honor and respect. That's a great comment, Debbie, and I appreciate that. Last time we really didn't get into much of the conversation about parents. We just only started with this part of that. Let me jump back to it. We had jumped to the idea where it said that we're not to provoke our children to wrath. And we talked about this one at length. I think this was an important one. The characteristic of parents, and of course it speaks to fathers here, but let's understand it probably implies both parents, both mothers and fathers. And the danger of the provocation to wrath, the idea that we drive them to a sense of resentment and bitterness. That's a pretty common thing. A lot of people will tell me about their home and growing up, and they'll have a great deal of bitterness towards their parents because of poor behavior or such. Sometimes, by the way, that maybe that bitterness isn't warranted. Sometimes, from what people describe, it certainly sounds like it is. And in that instance, what has happened is there has been a failure for a father and mother to raise their children without that resentment. We had some really great comments last week. I'm not able to bring up old comments. I really wish I could. But we had some really great comments last week talking about different ways that parents can avoid building that resentment. We want to understand, I remember somebody made the point about the person who discipline and perfection was forced into the home, and that can create that. It sure can. Ironically, sometimes that creates it in the name of trying to keep order in the home. It's a balance, right? I wouldn't expect any of us to walk into this passage and say, oh, I see what this passage says, I know what to do. In Titus chapter 2, it says that the older women and the older men are to teach the younger women and men. And more speaks to the older women and the younger women. But the idea is that we're supposed to be taught how to be parents. That we're supposed to be learning this from the people that have had experience in doing that. And that's an important thing in the church. In Titus chapter 2, part of the idea was that was something that was going to be going on within the church. In our congregation, we have lots of times where we study parenting. In fact, Wednesday nights, we're talking about Bible families with the hope of covering different ideas about how families ought to behave. It's important we teach each other, not just by that, but several people also made the observation that one of the most important things that we do in teaching each other is to set good examples. I remember when my kids were born, members of the church, I would look at them, and if I saw a family where they had raised their children not just to be Christians, and of course we say, well, that's all that matters, and it is, but also to have a good, positive relationship with their children, I would ask them, what kind of things did you do? How did you have this relationship? What kind of things did you do that brought that about? That as adults, your children are still interested in your opinions. I know we talked about that a little bit with Samson, that you want to raise your kids so that when they're adults, they're still interested in hearing the things that you have to say. And one thing, they would talk about things like, well, we had to develop respect. We had to show them that we genuinely cared, that they really mattered to us, and that they were important, and lots of different things. Like I said, certainly not enough time to cover it in this passage. But as we talked about last time, there's a lot of things that we do that we need to work on, that we need to perfect within ourselves. Nobody's a perfect parent. It's really tough. Teresa's got a good statement here. Teresa says, setting good expectations is okay, but not require perfection from our children. You're right, Teresa. That really is it, right? One of the things people told me is they said, Brian, your kids will embarrass you. And never be angry with them for embarrassing you. Be angry if they fail in the sense of godliness. Don't accept that. But your children are going to embarrass you, and don't ever let that be something that upsets you. And I always thought that was good advice, not to do that. Now, by the way, I say that I got a lot of bad advice too. I got a lot of terrible advice from different people. I remember in the course of 2 days, 2 people at church, one of them told me I needed to punish my children much more forcibly, and then somebody else within a week's time said I was overdoing it and I needed to quit punishing my children. I realized both of those extremes probably didn't benefit me, and I noticed in their families neither of them had successfully reached the place that I wanted to reach with their children. So that's an important thing to consider too, the kind of advice you get. I got another comment here from Lamar. Lamar says in verse 4, provoke to wrath is contrasted with training. You're exactly right. In fact, haven't got to that point yet, but Lamar, you're right on. There's the difference of provoking them to wrath, more training and admonition. And what's ironic is they both might be a lot of the same things, but with different purpose and goal. To finish your comment here, you said it's a parallel with Proverbs 22 and verse 16. You're going to make me look that up. I knew it. But Proverbs 22:16 is that verse we're all very familiar with. Train up a child in the way he'll go when he is old, and he will not depart from it. So remember this, by the way, this is a true ism. It's not something that 100% of the time is the case, but it is a general truth that that's our expectation and what we will receive. Parents' responsibility and may be slightly different for each child, yet still directed towards God. Lamar, there's some real valuable advice there, right? Lamar said that it's different with each child, and that was true in my home. I think every one of us who've had more than one child will say, yeah, that's been my experience too. Children are different. And it needs to be understood that's the case. These are some great comments. I want to move on now to the second part of this admonition to parents, the first being not to provoke our children to wrath. Lamar rightly said it's contrasted with the idea of what we're trying to accomplish. Now, we're not trying to accomplish a sense of discipline for discipline's sake. In other words, it's not the idea that I want to discipline my children so that they appear or come across disciplined. And I think a lot of times that might be a mistake that we make. You know, I want my children to behave a certain way so that it looks like they behave a certain way. And that's not a successful way to raise our children. In other words, our discipline shouldn't be for the sake of discipline. I don't discipline my children just for the sake of discipline. I discipline them with a goal. I have a purpose in mind. It even visits a little bit with what Lamar has said here, that the concept of driving them, provoking them to wrath, contrasted with training them in the admonition of the Lord. Discipline is supposed to have a purpose. And as I said, that purpose isn't so that everybody can see my kids and they can say, wow, look, those kids never do anything wrong. Instead, it's to be that they can see adults and maybe not even give me the credit, but say there's somebody whose behavior is godly. That's the desire we have in discipline. It's supposed to have a purpose, and that purpose is not for its own sake. Instead, it's the idea of the training and admonition of the Lord. I broke that point up there so that you can get two different ideas. And I would say this, every parent needs to understand that God gave you children with one goal, that you're supposed to return them to God. You're supposed to put them into the place of understanding what it is that they're supposed to do. You're supposed to bring them up in, first of all, the training of the Lord, and second of all, the admonition of the Lord. Now, training of the Lord, you might think of the idea like in a business. If I'm bringing an employee into the training of our company, that means I'm telling them the processes, procedures, expectations of that company. So the point here is that if I'm given children, God's expectation of me is that I'm going to prepare them to deliver them back to God. That one day they're not going to be under my supervision anymore or limited in some degree. And in that sense, that God's expectation of me is that I'm supposed to deliver them back. Now, the second thing is the admonition of the Lord. That might speak more to the idea of that willingness to be submissive to the Lord. There's a great comment here by Teresa. She says, requiring a child's obedience trains them to respect all authority, and in particular, God's authority. I would say that concept is in the admonition of the Lord, that the concept is that all of us are under that authority. One of the most important ways we teach that is by being under that authority ourselves, right? That we reveal or we make it clear that we ourselves are bound by that same authority. And by the way, sometimes that's not easy. You know, sometimes it's the case when your teenage son or your teenage daughter opens up the Bible and says, you know what, this passage, according to what this says, you didn't do that right. And that's happened in my home, terribly enough, that I have to say, you're right, because that passage is also my boss, so to speak. And one of the important ideas is that by raising our children in the admonition of the Lord, I'm telling them that when I hand them the Word of God as their authority, they have the right to open it and to put it to me. I can't be a hypocrite. I am utterly forbidden from that in this admonition. This is an important point to consider. Got another comment here. Stephen, I appreciate you giving us the verse in Proverbs 6:20. I've said before, sometimes it's kind of hard for me to jump around while we're doing things, so it's a little helpful if you're able to copy the verse in there like Stephen did. My son, daughter, observe the commandment of your father. Do not forsake the teaching of your mother. Here is the proverb writer saying that what somebody needs to do is to listen to the things that their parents have taught them. And of course, the characterization here would be the same as in Ephesians 6 if it's in the Lord. So that's an important point to consider. Lamar takes us over to Hebrews 12, and Hebrews 12 is a neat passage because there it talks about the chastisement of the Lord on all of the children of God. And Lamar says, goal of discipline is for children to respect the commands of God. And that's it. The big idea there, Lamar, I really appreciate that. The big idea is that my goal isn't that my children do everything I say as much as they do everything that God says. And what I tell them should be what God says. It should fall within that administration of authority. So that, again, is a great point. That's the goal that I'm trying to get them to see, is the importance of the authority of God. And by giving them that authority, it opens it up for that I have to be scrutinized as one who is right in that authority myself. And if I'm not, I don't get to say, well, I'm your father. You've got to listen to me, and that's that. If I'm going to be genuine in applying that authority to them, I myself have to be submissive to that authority too. That's not always easy, but it's certainly the case that it's true. Got a couple of comments here on Carrie said. Carrie says, kids need to see that God or the church is a priority. Right on, Carrie. That's exactly the idea that I want us to understand, that the number one way we give our children the training and admonition of the Lord is by ourselves being subject to that training and admonition. Very good. They've got to see that we ourselves hold these things to be the most important. Carrie, that's exactly right. This is especially hard when your kids will have other sports or activities they want to do. This was something my parents never budged in, and it had a big impact on me. Carrie, that's exactly right. And a lot of Christians have said, you know what? One of the things our kids need to understand is that while these other things might be important, that which is the most important is always God. And that's a great point to consider. That how it is that we rate the importance of God in our life, that's I guess I would say it like this. We shouldn't have any expectation that our children will have more or less. They're going to develop much like us, and we need to be prepared that we have given ourselves totally to these things if we hope for our children to be totally these things too. Those are some great comments that reflect how it is that we need to understand what's important. It needs to be understood. It's a great point, Carrie, that sometimes the things of God, the rules of God, are simply something we don't compromise on. The things of God aren't things that we say, well, if for my family, for my kids, I'm not going to require them to do the things that God says we have to do. And at that point, that we've just lost this battle. So those are some great comments that we have on this idea. This is a profound and important point, the concept of raising our children. And as I said, training would seem likely to fit within that context of the idea that we're teaching them the things that they're supposed to know before God. Admonition is the idea that we might be training them within the realm of the authority and the oversight of God. It's important that we're preparing our children. We're not just saying, well, I want you to make this choice for yourself, that we're doing everything we can to bring them to the point that they will see that choice too, that they will do what is right. And so as we kind of pick up here, I'm looking to see if we have any other comments, and we don't. We'll move on a little bit, and we'll start talking about this next point. And this next point's kind of interesting to think about here. He goes on to say at verse 5, bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not with eye servant, as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will, doing service as to the Lord, not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. Verses 5, 6, 7, and 8 speaks to the idea of bondservants. Different translations put that word differently. Let me grab the New American Standard and note that the word there is probably more accurately translated as the word slaves. Now, you'll note that whenever I've talked about these things, I've tried to use the term employees. And I hope you probably understand that the reason I'm doing that is first and foremost that that's the application of this passage today. that it speaks about somebody who is doing a job for somebody else. And in ancient times, if you're brought into the employ or the work of somebody else, in many ways you are that person's servant, and that term slave might aptly describe that. But this is a passage that's had a very charged past, in part because of the characteristic of slavery itself, particularly in the United States. I want to say very frankly that there is no question that the institution of slavery as it was practiced in the United States was an evil thing. And it was evil, ironically, because it violated many of the biblical laws about slavery. And there were quite a few laws about slavery. We've done some lessons on this in the past, and if you have interest in looking at those further in depth, what you can do is you can go to, it was a class or a lesson we did on March the 12th of 2017. You can go to our website and visit that. But one of the points we tried to make in that lesson is that in the Old Testament, there were a lot of laws about slavery. Slavery wasn't outlawed. Something that as Americans, as I said, we struggle to understand this and to appreciate that idea. But slavery itself wasn't outlawed under the Old or New Testament, but it was very, very strictly regulated. First of all, there were two kinds of slavery in the Old Testament: the slavery of Hebrews and the slavery of Gentiles. And Hebrew slaves had to be released after a certain amount of time. It was called the Jubilee. And that at the Jubilee, you were required to release your Jewish or your Hebrew slaves. Now, you could only be a Hebrew slave for one of two reasons. You owed a great debt to someone, or you had committed a crime. Those were the only two ways you could be a slave. Now, Gentiles could be slaves if they had been taken captive in battle. And that was the way that they themselves might also be found to be slaves among the Hebrews. They had very specific rights. You couldn't abuse them. You couldn't sexually assault them in any way. And if you did these things, the law of Moses was clear that the penalty was an eye for an eye. In other words, if a man were to harm his slave, that harm was to be brought back on him. You can see right away where the American institution of slavery had none of this within it. It had no sense of this. You weren't supposed to go out and capture slaves. In fact, it was a death penalty crime. They use the term sometimes just kidnapping, to go out just to secure slaves. The only reason you were ever supposed to have slaves was that you defeated somebody in battle. And to go out just for the sake of obtaining slaves was a death penalty sin, something God spoke about repetitively. So that, as I said, within the United States, what we had would have certainly been utterly condemned by God. It was sinful. The New Testament rules of slavery, as we're looking through them, I don't see that they're going to be too different, because we're going to be told that the expectation is pretty serious, and haven't got there yet what a master's obligation is yet, but we're going to come to that very importantly. But in this case, what I want us to understand is that when we're considering slavery in the Bible, let's not try to contrast this, that slavery was universally the same as the experience that many of us are familiar with in the United States. Slavery could mean anything from, like when somebody today joins the military, they sign a contract, they give themselves to that organization for a certain period of years. That would be very much more akin to the slavery of ancient times, of giving yourself over with the expectation that for a certain amount of time, you in a sense belong to that person. Those of you who have been in the military, you know your drill sergeant told you he owned you, I'm sure. And the point is that would be more apropos to what we're talking about in the Bible. The only thing that the Bible would have, and endorse isn't the right word, but that which the Bible speaks of here. But it's really more appropriate for us to consider the concept of slavery in terms or in regards to the idea of employment, of committing ourselves to serving somebody with the expectation that we're going to receive something back from them. And to that end, let's consider the things that we're being told here to do. Going back to our passage again, what we see here is it says we're to be obedient to those who are our masters according to the flesh. It says to be obedient with fear and trembling. Now, that concept might be described as reverence or, the sense of a fear of failure to that end. That's a good way of considering that idea. And it goes on to say, in sincerity, not with eye service. That means you're not just doing it to look good. You have a genuine desire to do well. And then verse 7 says, goodwill doing service as to the Lord and not to men. These characteristics are the characteristics of what it is to be a righteous employee before God. So I guess we would want to understand that whatever company or corporation or business I work for, here is Paul saying, when I do that job, I'm doing that job as though I am working for Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. That whatever I'm doing, my expectation is that God will take care of me. Teresa's got a comment here I want to grab and bring in. When working for a hard employer, you may have to do things you don't enjoy or want to do, as long as it's not something sinful. It's a great point. It's important to understand that conversation here, that is what it means to do things that we may not want to do. And I would say part of what we're going with this is the idea of serving with goodwill means it may not be something I desire to do, as long as it's not something sinful. I've had to tell employers I would not do something. That's a good point, Teresa. I know I always give young people advice. If you're going to take a job, they may say, we want you to work Sunday or we want you to work Wednesday. And it's not so much to say it's ever a sin that the moment you've worked on a Sunday or Wednesday, you've sinned. But the moment you tell them yes, they'll continue to do so. It's important for us to understand that, and particularly when you're just moving into the career field. If you give in a little bit, that's too much. Teresa makes a good point to consider about that. Stan, by the way, I apologize. I see your comment, and I wished we had brought it up just a few minutes before, talking about the admonition, fear of the Lord. You said the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fear of the Lord is begging of instruction. And that really is a good point to consider. Sorry, Stan, I didn't get that comment in sooner as we look at these things. You owe your employer, number one, in obedience. That's always been a struggle for me. Having worked for various corporations, I worked for a major corporation. I worked for small companies. I've worked for the government. And sometimes you get asked to do things, just like Teresa said, that I'm not necessarily wanting to do. Have you ever heard somebody say, that's not my job? Well, one of the things that here we're being told to do is to understand that we owe a degree of obedience that we would owe to God. I'm not saying necessarily it's sinful if I were to tell my boss that's not my job, but conversely, if God said to me, Brian, I want you to mow somebody's lawn, I might say, well, that's not my job. But if God asked me, wouldn't I do it? We want to appreciate and understand the idea. And a lot of times, what's our reasoning? We say, well, if I do the job, then I'm demeaning myself, then I'm, allowing myself to do things. But remember verse 8. That says whatever good you do, God will take care of you for it. The things you're doing right, God's going to bless you and give you a response for that. It's hard to be an obedient employee. Somebody who listens to what they're instructed to do and then does it. That's not always something easy to do, but it's important to understand that's part of the expectation of being a righteous employee. Number one, that I'm going to do what it's expected or asked to do. I used to always say, I'd work for somebody and, I'd say if they told me I had to wear only red shirts to work, I'd wear only red shirts to work because they're the boss. And the point was that I owe a degree of obedience. That might be an extreme example, but I owe a degree of obedience. And lots of times people would complain about, the dress codes at work. And I used to always say, it doesn't really matter. That's the dress code. That's the dress code. Lamar's got a comment, and then Stan. Verse 6 has special meaning for many of us who are working from home right now. Boy, Lamar, that really is a tricky point, right? He goes on to say, we still need to do our work as though to the Lord. And Lamar's point is, we're not necessarily having the attention on us and on our work that we've had in the past. For the last few months, you're working from home. You've had a lot of leeway that you've never had before. I would want to hope that as Christians, we say to ourselves, and you're going to get just as hard a work from me as you ever did, because God has always been watching Lamar, that's a great point for us to consider. That right now, especially, ought to be a time when those who are in Christ are delivering a work ethic that really does reach this point. Stan says to be an employee, we must give our best all of the time. Now, Stan gives us some examples here. He says no long breaks, no extra long lunches, no arriving late, no leaving early without permission. And Stan, what I think about this one a lot. And I think that, of course, different jobs are different ways. I worked for companies where a lot of times all that was expected of me was that I delivered a certain amount of work. Like Rob Wade. Rob, if you're listening in, I'm using you as an example. I used Rob as an example in our sermon this morning. Now in our online class tonight, Rob's going to be tired of this. But, if you're familiar with Rob's work, he's all over the place and he kind of sets his own schedule. And I've worked like that. And in circumstances like that, maybe these same rules might not apply. But, like Stan's saying, if I worked in an office environment, there's an expectation that I'm giving the right and appropriate amount of work. Sometimes we're paid for our time. Sometimes we're paid for our product. And the point is that the expectation, whatever they're expecting to receive from me, I need to give them. And that's important. That's something that's important for us to consider and to understand. It's a great comment there, Stan, for us to see and to consider. Kind of goes on to what was said here, that we wanted. The second point was the idea that we're giving them an obedience with fear and trembling. And that, like I said, that's a reverential obedience because we're really giving it to God. I'm not scared in the companies I've worked for in the past, I'm not scared of my boss. I'm not fearful of him, but I'm fearful of God. And so I'm doing what they said, knowing that really I'm just a temp employee and that the agency I work for is the kingdom of heaven. And I'm just on loan to this company and I don't want it to get back to the kingdom of heaven because they're actually giving to me a far greater wage than I might consider. But the second thing is the concept of a sincerity in our worship, in our service. It says in sincerity of heart, not with eye service. Now that idea of eye service, I think probably all of us understand the terminology there. It applies in the way that I think it's Chris. Chris says Rob's always been that way. He's pretty amazing. You're right, Chris. He is the way he works around and gets things done. It is something. But it really is an important thing to understand the sincerity that we owe to God or to our boss is that we're supposed to genuinely serve them. Not just with eye service, not just looking good. And, you might understand what it means to look good versus to actually do good. That there's a lot of times where people can look good and be deceiving their boss. Usually employees like that don't last long because it's usually found out they're not carrying their weight, things like that. My father used to have a great story about a coworker who could just talk a great talk, but frankly was never very thorough in carrying out what it was that was expected of them. We need to serve whether or not we're being watched. And it goes back to what Lamar said a second ago about the concept of right now, for many of us, we're not being watched anywhere nearly like we have been. And the point is that we need to give the kind of service that understands that God is watching and he's mindful of that. The third point there was the concept of serving with goodwill. Verse 7, with goodwill doing service as to the Lord and not to men. So I was thinking about that statement, the idea of serving with goodwill. And I suppose one of the things we might think about is the idea that I genuinely want to the success of the company or the business or the master that I'm working for. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the idea of Joseph in the Old Testament. You remember Joseph way back in the book of Genesis. You begin reading about him back Genesis 39 all the way to chapter 50. And Joseph is one of the most important moral examples in the Old Testament. He's one of the few guys that we can genuinely say we don't find fault with. He had the most important characteristics of a godly person. And I pointed out to you before that a lot of times the Jewish rabbis, when they talked about the Messiah, they would talk about him as both being the son of David and the son of Joseph by character. That his character in servant and being the good servant, Joseph was the ultimate servant in the Old Testament, right? We remember the story of Joseph, don't you? That Joseph first was sold into slavery. He was bought by an Egyptian, Potiphar, and he began to devote himself to the service of Potiphar and to the genuine good service, the goodwill of his master's house. He really wanted to perform well for his master. And the Word of God says, it's kind of neat when you read that story. If you're not familiar with the story, go read it. It really is a great story. But the idea is that when he devoted himself to service, that Potiphar looked at it and he saw everything he gave to Joseph turned out well, because Joseph genuinely wanted things to go well for his master. Remember what happens, right? He gets betrayed by the master's wife and then gets sent to prison. What does he do in prison? He begins that service again. He's that good servant to the warden, and pretty soon the warden puts him in charge of everything. Again, because he had a genuine goodwill. Well, then he gets elevated to being the prime minister of Egypt. What does he do there? He has a genuine goodwill for his master, to the degree that he goes through a process of buying back the whole country of Egypt and delivering it to Pharaoh. He did none of this to benefit himself. He did it for the goodwill of the one person that was above him, the leader of Egypt. He was the prime minister of Egypt. It's a great story. And nobody in the Bible really fits better other than Christ. Nobody really fits better the language of what we're talking about here, of the goodwill that a servant, that an employee is supposed to have for the employer. We are supposed to want the best for those that we work for, to give them a genuine service that has their interest in mind. And that's a big deal. Got a couple of comments here I want to grab. Stephen James has a good one. He takes us to the New Testament, to the book of Philemon, and he reminds us of Onesimus. Onesimus was a slave who had run away, kind of the background there in Philemon, and Paul sent him back to his master. His master was a Christian. Onesimus was no longer to be considered as a slave to Philemon, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. Now, by the way, Stephen, Philemon is going to be our great example for the fulfillment of the master, or the one who is in charge of others, who is a supervisor, who is an employer. And so that's a good point that you're bringing us to there, a real important point. Teresa goes on to say, if we show goodwill to our employer, they should value us as an employee, and God may bless us and our employer because of our behavior. Teresa, what you said there is important. That's what happened with Joseph, right? I mean, the nation of Egypt, historically, that we know this to be true, it became its most powerful during the time that Joseph was the prime minister. I mean, and by the way, the Bible really doesn't specify that it became the most powerful, but we know historically that Egypt was at its zenith of power, its greatest points of power in the mid 15th century BC. That's about the time Joseph was there. And the point is that Joseph handled all these things well, and God blessed that entire country. There's lots of times in the Bible where it speaks of godly people blessing a company. The ones that they work for receive a blessing from them. And like Teresa says, they treat them well. There are some times, though, when that's not the case. And that goes back to what verse 8 tells us, that when that's not the case, don't worry about it. Don't feel like, well, I'm doing all this and they're not treating me right, because God says, I'll take care of that. I'll take care of that. Again, like I said, you're like a temp employee. You're working for another company, but you actually work for the kingdom. And the kingdom, they'll straighten this out. You don't straighten this out. They'll straighten this out for you. You keep giving the service that you're dedicated to giving. And that's the point that we want to consider in these things. Lamar's got a comment now. Lamar says, Proverb 31 comes to mind as someone who did good work for her family and helped the poor along the way. Very good point. Proverbs 31, we sometimes say the Proverb 31 woman. And we speak about her virtues and her characteristics. And Lamar says, here is a woman who manages a business. It describes she's a buyer and seller of things in mercantile, and at the same time manages her home, and and then also it takes care of the poor. Lamar, one of my favorite verses there, it talks about the law of kindness is upon her lips. I love that terminology for her behavior, and that is a great statement about somebody who could help others while at the same time take care of their business. That's really important? Well, as I said, a lot of times it's hard to be that employee. We live in a world, especially in the American system, where we can move jobs very easily. And I've said before, in ancient times, it really wasn't the case. You didn't go down the road of being a carpenter and then decide you wanted to be a stonemason a few years into it. Well, you were in your profession all your life. You really didn't move around professions very much. That was a rare, extreme, unusual thing. And you didn't change. If you worked for someone, you probably were going to work for them all your life. Your sons might work for them. Your grandsons might work for them. Those circumstances were often the case. Today in our world, we often have the ability to say, if I'm not happy in a job, I can go somewhere else. And that's so fine. That's not, that wouldn't be a problem, something to consider. We know that that Christians are authorized in a similar way, that if a government isn't being fair to them, they have an authority, a permission to leave and to go somewhere else, immigrate, we might say. We see the apostles leaving the jurisdiction of those that were persecuting them in the book of Acts chapter 12. So we have that example for us. But the point is that while I'm there, I owe them my very best. The world's going to say, hey, if you give your employer more than they're paying you for, you're a fool. Well, remember, the things that God sees as wise, the world calls foolish, right? Remember that from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where it talks about the wisdom of the world is foolishness to God, and what is foolishness to the world is wisdom in the eyes of God. That the point is that God has established a concept of what it is that he wants us to do. And the world's not going to like that. The world's going to say, hey, you work for somebody and you overdo it for them, you're a fool. Well, frankly, I think that that's, of course, contrary to the scripture. But I think in the long term, that also doesn't behoove us, that the consequences of being that kind of employee are never very good. If you're a young person, excuse me, if you're a young person, you're starting off in your work career, you're starting off in your time of work, you need to understand and appreciate that you owe whoever you work for your very best. And you owe it to them not because they've deserved it or they earn it or they're going to make it worth your while. You owe it to them because God has said, you owe it to me. And a lot of times we give it to them and we get frustrated because it's not recognized, it's not appreciated, it's not considered. And yet God says, trust me, I'm considering it. I'm taking account of it, and I will take care of things. Whatever good anyone does, he'll receive the same from the Lord, slave or free. Whatever you do, it's going to be returned to you. It's going to be taken care of. God took care of Joseph. Despite the fact that Joseph served his master diligently, and then his master, because of his master's wife, betrayed him, threw him in jail. Joseph ultimately had even an opportunity to strike back, maybe at his master, at his brothers. That's probably even the better example of what Joseph was, not just the good servant, but the forgiving man. That's why, as I said, Joseph's probably one of the most moral people of the Old Testament, the most Christ-like people in the Old Testament, was somebody well worth our time to consider. I don't want to go too much further. Our next point is going to be talking about employers. There's not a lot about that in the New Testament. It's interesting that when Peter uses his parallel of this passage, he doesn't even mention the master. He just talks about being the servant and righteous. And I guess some of that is the idea that there just weren't many masters or rich people. Paul would say not many successful people in the world come to Christ. That's true because successful people tend to not have the same sense of, I need Christ. The Beatitudes speak about the concept of the kingdom of heaven being a blessing to those that are poor in spirit, that grieve, that mourn, that struggle with righteousness. People that aren't on that list, it's not as appealing to them. And that perhaps is why there's so little said about masters. You see verse 9 there is about the only statement. We're going to come back. We're going to visit that briefly. And then we're going to move on next Sunday, Lord willing, to a passage many of us are very familiar with, a passage that speaks about the armor of God and what it means to put on the armor of God. But at this point, we come to the end of our time, and so very grateful. We had some great comments tonight, and as we say all the time, we're so very glad if you're visiting that you're here. anything we say, you got any questions, any follow-up, you reach out to me. Let me know. As I said, I love to hear from people. I love to hear questions that you have. You need explanations. You need me to clarify something because you're not sure. The Bible's, excuse me, the Bible says that that's the Berean attitude of Acts chapter 17. And the Bible says that's a noble thing. When you refuse to take my word for it, but you want to see what the Word of God says, I'm always glad to give an answer from the Scriptures for anything that we say or do. Thanks so much for your time today, and may God bless you in the rest of this week.